I'm Kyle. I'm a founding partner of Build Consulting. Peter Miris is also on today's call with me. He'll be serving as the moderator later when we enter the Q&A section of today's webinar. Here are some tips to get the most from today's webinar. The first is we're going to be answering questions after my presentation, which should go about 20 minutes. And Peter's going to be helping me out, as I said. Next, our recommendation is that you avoid multitasking. Personally, I'm prone to this, especially with this security incident. For those of you who are in rapid response mode, you might feel pulled in multiple directions. But if you multitask, you might miss the best part. Lastly, after the webinar, via email, we'll be providing links via email. They're going to be in both video and MP3 form. And just a quick promo, I'll be focused on something in our next webinar that is a little bit more upbeat. I'm going to be leading a webinar presentation about Microsoft Dynamics and Salesforce and what you need to know before you choose one of those platforms. That's on Wednesday, August 12th at 12 p.m. during the lunch hour. A little bit about Build before we get started. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations and have served more than 1,000 organizations. We help our clients through incidents like these and more proactively making IT and IS decisions that ultimately are done in support of an organization's mission. And lastly, we work in a very collaborative way. Our work is constructed in a way where we empower you to make decisions using our expert guidance and support. All our services are designed to help clients transform. They're designed to help you serve constituents better, and those constituents can range from funders, from donors, beneficiaries, volunteers, your board, and the general public. We've never had to put a disclaimer like this in webinars that we have done before like this, but we want to be clear today that we are not lawyers. We do think, however, that the stakes surrounding this incident are incredibly high, and your decision should be guided by what your legal obligations may be based on the extent of the breach as it pertains to your specific organization. Again, this is an incredibly serious data breach, and we had to develop this webinar in record time. We wanted to respond to what we see as an emergent issue, and we want to give you information that we have been able to gather along the way, as well as our experience dealing with incidences like these that have occurred with other vendors and for other organizations. There's three things we want to cover today. One, we want to give you a bit of background, hopefully focused not on what is publicly available and what has been conveyed to us via email for affected clients, via the Blackbaud support pages that they have created for affected organizations, via the press, and via subsequent webinars that Blackbaud has put on. We want to identify what we see as some of the potential risks. And lastly, we want to talk about ways to think about and prepare for potential responses. As we learn more about this incident through disclosure by Blackbaud, some of this background information may change. From our perspective, we are getting incremental information from Blackbaud that doesn't yet satisfactorily answer questions about the short, mid, and long-term impacts on Blackbaud customers, or potentially the entire nonprofit sector, as people become concerned about the security of their information when interacting with nonprofit organizations. This was taken from the email that was provided to an affected customer. This is what Blackbaud disclosed. We think the information that's bolded on this slide is reasonably straightforward. And what remains for us and for many of the clients we serve are significant questions about what was not bolded. Those questions include, what is the risk of the copies of data that was taken? What is the risk to organizations? How do we know that the copy has been destroyed? And lastly, how did the cyber criminals get access? How do we know it hasn't happened before? How do we know that it won't happen again in the same way? Blackbaud has cited in their communications that cybercrime's a multi-billion industry. According to the 2019 Internet Crime Report from the FBI, who is apparently doing the criminal investigation in the US around this event, cybercrime in 2019 losses were just north of $3 billion. Losses from attacks that are labeled or classified as ransomware in 2019 were just shy of $9 million. However, I want to read directly from what the FBI 2019 Internet Crime Report said, because I think it's important. Regarding ransomware adjusted losses, this number does not include estimates of lost business, time, wages, files, or equipment, or any third-party remediation services required by a victim. In some cases, victims did not report any loss amount to the FBI, thereby creating an artificially low overall ransomware loss rate. So what have we learned? We've learned in subsequent interactions with Blackbaud that a breach occurred sometime between February 7th, 2020 and May 20th, 2020. We know that the technical investigation done by a third party has been completed, and we also know that the criminal investigations are ongoing. And I say investigations because for folks that are in the UK or the EU or other countries, presumably law enforcement in those countries are involved in the investigation. Again, from an early webinar that we attended, a question was asked about whether Blackbaud can provide a copy of the data that was removed, and they indicated that they cannot. We believe this impact to be widespread. Nearly all of Build's clients have been impacted in some way. There are nearly 150 people on today's webinar that we announced less than 48 hours ago. For us, that is indicative of the extent and reach of this breach on Blackbaud customers. And I think I mentioned this already, and just a little bit of a note, for Build clients that had products in the Azure Windows Azure that were hosted by Blackbaud in Azure, or host their own data, they were not affected. But anyone else who was self-hosted, they have all been impacted in some way. Lastly, what we learned was, or not lastly, what I wanted to say next was Blackbaud has experienced long wait times for their incident response hotline. To us, that's another indication that they are being inundated with requests for more information and details and for potential remediation steps for their affected customers. Another thing that we wanted to share is that Blackbaud disclosed that the organization that the data was associated with was not disclosed, that within the data itself, the only information that was included was your organization's site ID. However, we think it would be easy for anyone who is capable of intruding into Blackbaud systems and accessing this data in the ways that they were able to do, would be able to make inferences about which organization for whom they have data. So what are the things that we don't know? We don't know how the breach occurred. And that's important information for us to understand the extent to which Blackbaud believes that it can remedy that vulnerability in short periods of time, or if it's going to be a longer term fix. We do know that some organizations, and again, I would underscore some, were asked to reset their users' passwords, but not all. So that might be telling about the nature of the exploit. We know that the cyber criminals were expelled from the system, but again, we don't know what measures Blackbaud has taken since becoming aware of the criminal activity. Blackbaud's committed to monitor the dark web, but they haven't made any specific commitments about how long that will continue. And lastly, we don't have any details about how Blackbaud can assure us that the data that was taken was actually destroyed. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, this is the message that Blackbaud seems to be conveying. If that's the major takeaway, that's concerning. If our house was burglarized and they held me hostage and they got a ransom for my wife, but on their way out the door, they took a copy of the keys, I would hope she wouldn't say, they got what they wanted, they won't come back. We don't need to be concerned. So what are some of the potential risks? As we learn more about this instance through disclosure by Blackbaud, this might change. Again, from our perspective, we have incomplete information. But imagine if the data was used in a phishing attempt to your entire database with a link to a page other than yours and a call to action to call a number if their information is incorrect or out of date. This would be a highly personalized phishing attempt. The losses in 2019 from these types of attacks were north of $300 million. Imagine a more sophisticated attack, something that is called spear phishing, where they go after a specific person, where they target your high net worth donors, where they solicit direct engagement with someone purporting to be a part of your organization. For many of Blackbaud products, their CRM products, part of the data that was exposed included activities with staff and what staff members were involved. Again, from the FBI, the losses from spear phishing were just about $60 million in 2019. There's a wealth of information that's available to help aid in some confidence schemes. So what we performed for one of our clients was a sample risk assessment, and this data has been anonymized. So what we did was we identified all of the data that was unencrypted that was included in their instance of the Razor's Edge. This organization uses the Razor's Edge. And their instance, we color-coded their legend so that we identified areas of data that were low risk and areas that were high risk. So some of the things to consider as you think about responding to this incident. This is based on Blackbaud's guidance, and the way that they frame the decision is, firstly, what are you required by federal, state, territory, et cetera? What are you required to disclose? And my understanding, again, I'm not an attorney, is it is not just the regulations of the states in which you have physical presences, but it is the states in which you hold data for constituents that are residents of those states. But again, I can't underscore enough that guidance from your legal counsel ultimately should be the arbiter of whether you're required to make disclosures to specific constituents. Secondly, the other part of the decision framework is simply, what is the right thing to do? Every organization is going to look at this differently. While we implore you to seek legal protections to make sure you're approaching this correctly, irrespective of the legal implications, and while I'm not offering tacit advice, you're going to see that I clearly have a point of view on this. So if you choose not to disclose, I want to talk a little bit about some of the implications if you choose not to disclose. Again, some of this information that is disseminated today is being anonymized, so we don't include any specifics from clients or organizations we work with. Many organizations have already started to notify their constituents. If you have not disclosed to your constituents, they might already know. The question is, what could be the risk to your organization if you knew but didn't provide the opportunity to your constituents for them to learn more about it. Going back to the question about how do we know that the data was destroyed by the cyber criminals? The question is, what if the data is used later? What if the way that they value that data and they've retained it changes over time? Who will be held responsible? Lastly, if you choose not to disclose and later there's a subsequent breach, what is the risk to your brand? So if you choose to disclose, some questions that you should be thinking about. The first is, how will you respond to potential inbound requests from constituents, from VIPs like board members, and from the media if the media happens to reach out? How will you respond to requests from constituents where they say, I want to see all of the data that was exposed as part of the risk, or sorry, as part of the breach? Few of Blackbaud systems easily provide that information that include a comprehensive field listing of all of the fields that were tracked about a constituent. How will you do that in a way that protects them, provides them what they do, and give them some sense of what the information that was part of this breach included? And then lastly, if somebody requests to have their data entirely deleted, how will you provide confirmation to constituents? And secondarily, to the extent that these systems integrate with your financial systems, how do you maintain that integration for reconciliations and audit purposes? So if you received a donation for somebody for $50 and you remove their record and later subsequently an audit, they want to have, the auditor wants to see that donation, questions remain unanswered for us about how to facilitate that type of request. So here are some potential silver linings. This has hardly been the most optimistic webinar that I have ever done before. The first is, this is an opportunity for you to raise the importance of understanding the potential points of weaknesses within your organization around your systems and technology that you use. Revisit your usage standards. A question that is coming up for us is, what constitutes data that should not be stored? If I attend an event and I behave badly and somebody records that information in a database and I subsequently ask for a copy of that data, that information should be included in there. This is an opportunity to revisit data that simply should not be recorded in a system like a CRM system. There's an opportunity to revisit your audit practices. So hopefully organizations have regular audit practices for data quality. What are the audit practices around data that is stored improperly, either in unencrypted fields or data that should not be stored at all? This is an opportunity to revisit all manners of data governance and usage across your organization. This is an opportunity to implement data use policies for staff, for those of you who have volunteers engaging with your systems. Others, what are their policies around acceptable use, around protecting sensitive information, and around accessing sensitive systems? And then roll out multi-factor authentication on every application you can. Unfortunately, some of the more prevalent Blackbaud products do not currently support multi-factor authentication. We know that Blackbaud recommended to many organizations instituting more regular password resets and forced resets. As one of the partners at Built said, that's table stakes at this point. That's recommendations that are antiquated. The most modern and effective way, or one of the most modern and effective ways to protect confidential information via password protection, is through multi-factor authentication. Lastly, our advice is don't be passive. And again, this is going to look different for every single organization. What does having an active response look like? We think that Blackbaud needs to provide more information to affected customers so that you can communicate more information to constituents who are understandably going to be really concerned. With that, we're going to move into the QA. I hope that for those of you who drop, I hope that today provided some new information and some new considerations as you think about charting a path forward. And with that, I'm going to take a sip of water and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Peter Maris.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We have about 20 questions that have come in so far. I'd encourage you to use the Q&A feature to do that if you can, and if not, you can go ahead and chat them in. And I'm going to ask Kyle to answer the questions in the order that they were placed. So the first question is from Denise Kyle, and she wants to know, why did it take 2 months for Blackbaud to notify their clients of the attack? The attack happened in May, and we weren't notified until mid-July.
So I don't know the answer to that, but I can make some inferences. I believe because it was a technical investigation and a criminal investigation, that there was probably a need to hold off on disclosing it to customers. And I recognize that may not be a satisfactory answer. And on top of that, that is my best inference as to why it took so long. I did take the opportunity, Denise, to ask a colleague of mine who's a chief information security officer at a major university system, whether he thought the length of time it took to disclose the breach was abnormal, and he did not, even though understandably all of us would want to know just as soon as possible.
Thanks. And thanks, Denise, for submitting that question. And an anonymous attendee wants to know, if we have not gotten an official notice from Blackbaud, would it be safe to say our organization is safe?
I think that's a question to pose to Blackbaud, but based on what they're communicating, they only communicated with affected organizations. It's I feel very, very glad that you were not affected by this. And I think that given the number of people that were affected, it's unlikely by this point, based on what they've communicated, that if you were affected, that you have not yet been notified.
Great. Next question is from Kathleen, and she wants to know, do you know if this story is out in the press? Will our donors read about this in the Wall Street Journal or some other publication?
I know that it has been publicized in both ZDNet and also the Nonprofit Times, perhaps in other places. And I'll confess that we at Build have been in such rapid response mode as we've been supporting our clients who have been impacted, that I have not had an opportunity to monitor the broader press. But those are two places that that it has been covered. A board member of an organization that we work with actually found the information there. She happens to follow technology news fairly closely, so she brought the question to the organization about whether the organization had been impacted by the breach.
Thanks, Kathleen. Paul wants to know, was the breach specific to Razor's Edge or also the Financial Edge?
It affected, so my belief is it affected a number of products that Blackbaud identified as being self-hosted. And given the geographic distribution, my inference is that the breach happened for products that were hosted in the Boston data center. That is 100% conjecture. I think, like all of you, we are trying to do as much sleuthing and inference building as we can. But in direct answer to your question, for the clients that we interact with, we have heard of instances where it impacted Research Point, the Razor's Edge, the Financial Edge, and Net Community, which is a deprecated product of Blackbaud. However, just a quick note on Net Community. One of the questions that we have is whether usernames and passwords were exposed as part of the breach. And if they were, our concern is that unfortunately, many people reuse passwords. And so if usernames and passwords were disclosed as part of the breach, that constitutes for us perhaps a different type of communication to the constituents that were contained within those data sources.
Thanks to Paul for that question. Esther wants to know, I assume that all non-encrypted fields were taken by the cyber criminals. How likely or possible is it that they also got copies of attachments, like PDFs of acknowledgement letters?
That is a good question, and I don't have the answer to that. For one organization, they have asked for PDF copies of everything that was attached to constituent records within their CRM solution. Fortunately, the organization that I'm referencing did not do that extensively, so it's not a big lift to be able to provide that. There was only about 26 instances of it, so it was clearly a staff person who thought it was a good idea for a short period of time. But I don't know what the ability as part of the breach, what their ability would have been to get attachments that were stored as part of a CRM solution.
Mm-hmm. Aaron wants to know, if we did not get an email that we were part of this breach, do we disclose, and what do we disclose?
I think I would go back. I think that really is going to be an organizational decision, unfortunately. Um, I think the question for me is, for organizations that were not affected, if they can they take more of a wait and see approach with respect to how broadly this becomes aware. It seems at a minimum that being prepared to have a response to constituents who ask the question, was your organization impacted, that you have a response mechanism in place.
Thanks for that question, Aaron. David wants to know, what have your clients or others decided to do? Rough percentage of notify versus not notify.
I can speak for the clients that I engage with actively, and I can only speak to 3 of them use Blackbaud products that were impacted by this breach, and 2 of the 3 of them are actively preparing to respond to constituents and notify constituents of the breach. The third one, I just simply don't know where they are in that decision-making process, but I believe the 2 organizations, I believe that it's safe to speak for them that they believe they have a duty to notify constituents. Peter, I don't know if I don't know if you have any clients that you work with directly that have made that decision.
I do not. My clients currently are not using Razor's Edge products, so, which is rare for me because their prevalence. Ashley had asked, this is one for me to answer, will the recordings be available, or will this content be available after the presentation? Again, we will be sharing the recordings in both YouTube video and downloadable MP3 formats later this afternoon, and we'll be sending out an email to all registrants to that effect, so keep an eye out for that. David wants to know, also same David as before, I think, is it your understanding that Blackbaud was not legally required to tell us about this breach?
That's a good question that I just simply don't have an answer to, unfortunately, David.
Rick says, to confirm, there was no breach if we hosted Blackbaud with a third-party hosting company or if we used the Azure environment?
Our understanding is that the products impacted are what Blackbaud describes as self-hosted, which to me is a little bit confusing because when I think of self-hosted, I think of an organization hosting their data themselves. But for the purposes of what they have announced to date, self-hosted means that Blackbaud hosts it in a data center that is not Azure.
Thanks for that question. Let me see who's next. Aaron wants to know, should we be looking at another organization for our data needs? I am being asked to look into that.
That's an excellent question, and I think in some ways, I think it would be it's a responsible question to ask. And having said that, data breaches do happen. As the article in the nonprofit time that covered this breach mentioned, another vendor also was the victim of a ransomware attack. So I think that unfortunately, organizations should not presume that this is a one-time event for them that is going to be limited to Blackbaud. That said, without knowing the nature of the attack or the method by which the attack was done, it's hard to know whether this was the result of something that we believe Blackbaud could have addressed, or whether this is just the nature of cybercrime in 2020. If you do elect to look elsewhere, because I think that many organizations are frustrated, understandably, or angry, moving new solutions, perhaps many of you have been through this process before, is something that should be done thoughtfully. Obviously, security would be a huge question that I would want to understand better as you looked at new vendors. How do they approach security? What precautions do they have in place? Have they had incidents before? In addition to really understanding that if you're going to leave one solution for another, understanding what the change management impacts would be in terms of making that change, what the scale of the change would be in terms of disruption to your organization, and making sure that everyone involved understood the cost to the organization of making that change.
Cool. We have so many questions to answer. Good thing we've got plenty of time remaining. I think we still have 20 odd questions that have been
I
sent
think I'm
in
going to
so
need
far.
another glass of water at some point.
Yeah, I'll take on the next question. Adrian wants to know, what does that mean, multi-factor authentication? Typically, this means that there is another piece of information required that's unique to the individual and is that's logging in and is a point in time kind of thing. It's usually some sort of authentication code that is either brought up on on an authenticator app that's on on a smartphone like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, or perhaps a code that is texted to the individual's smartphone on record or cell phone on record when they're trying to log in, or even a call that goes from the system to the cell phone number for the person that's attempting to log in, asking to provide the authentication code or ask them to enter it in on their phone's keypad. So it's an extra level of security that basically means we're going to authenticate you by your username and password and by this other method. Kathleen wants to know, how can we find out which fields are in our production database? When I asked Blackbaud which fields were included in the cyber incident, they tell me it's the same fields that are in our production database.
I would rank that up there from Blackbaud as one of the more frustrating responses, because that is a really difficult thing to provide. What they have said in multiple places is just to look at your database, and those are the fields that were exposed. That is an incredibly laborious way to inventory all of the fields that were included. For those of you who are using Razor's Edge, if it gets to the point that we need to inventory at a field by field level, my plan was to use the import tool within Razor's Edge to create header rows for every single type of data that's included. However, I'm not 100% sure that all of the fields that are available are included in those import fields. Things that I think, and I can just tell you what I'm most concerned about. I'm concerned about all of the places that have open text fields. So that includes interactions, it includes notes associated with GIFs, it includes relationship notes, it includes um, event participation notes. They're in a number of places. Just as a point of reference for folks, there are tools out there that will scan text fields or scan any fields to identify personally identifiable information that's included in those fields when you say they shouldn't be included in those types of fields. That, for some organizations, is going to be a logical next step if they believe that there is the risk that their data in open text field might have contained a single credit card number or contained for an educational institution someone's social security number or something that would be considered highly confidential information, or for organizations that have other compliance issues like HIPAA or FERPA information in those fields.
John wants to know, can you repeat what was said regarding the difference between where the organization, us, is located and where the donors are located, specifically where those are in different states?
Sure. Again, feel like I should just have this. I should have a button that says this. I think consulting your attorney is ultimately what should be the arbiter or the answer to this question. But for the organization for the organization that I have the most familiarity with, my understanding is that it is not the rules and regulations around disclosing data breaches are not particular to where you are geographically located, or if you have multiple locations. It is about where the constituent uh, lives. And so this is not dissimilar to US based organizations who engage in the EU. You are subject to GDPR irrespective of whether you have offices in the EU.
Mhm. Derek notes that the data breach was also reported in a local Charleston newspaper and through a few posts on LinkedIn. I think it has also been covered on Reddit. It came up several times based on his Blackbaud Daily Google alert, so he just wanted to let folks who had asked that question earlier about whether it was out there in the press know about those things as well. Thanks for that, Derek. Um, Ashley notes, we were not hosted by Blackbaud at the time of the breach, and it seems they may not have destroyed our live data and thus also had our backups. Um, so this is a case in which they, yeah. So how would you address that, Kyle?
I hadn't considered that, Ashley. I think that's a great question. What their data retention policies are at Blackbaud and whether it's possible that your data was impacted. Something that kept me up last night, not figuratively, but literally kept me up last night, is that a client that I've been working with is going through massive data hygiene and cleansing projects that are that were not connected to this event itself. So the data that was in a picture of a constituent record as of May 20th, 2020 is going to look different than it does today. So it's not just data that was added since that time, things like GIFs or additional information. It is things that might have been changed or removed. And this organization, I would say, has hoarded data over time. And so a lot of what the cleanup we've been doing is actually identifying what the high quality data is, the data that actually informs strategy rather than serving just simply as information that has questionable value. So I haven't yet resolved how to do this or what our responsibilities are. But the truth is, we can't, for all constituents, say affirmatively, this is the data that was available and present as of May 20th, 2020, because of hygiene projects that were taking place concurrently with the Blackbaud investigation and the criminal investigation and the third party technical investigation.
Um, let's see, what's a good next question to ask here? This question, another anonymous attendee wants to know, not a question. We were hosted by Blackbaud during initial setup to create custom fields to hold some PII that they did not support. We are assuming none of these custom fields were encrypted, and we do have notifications. Do you happen to know, Kyle, whether data that was held in custom fields was able to be was included in the breach?
I mean, given what Blackbaud disclosed, it seems as though it was an entire backup copy of the entire database. That the only things that they have identified, at least, and I should say that the only notifications that we have seen as part of build are the notifications to customers that have affected products. So if the question is about a product that we haven't seen, the answer might have been different. But it is the entirety of the database. It is unlimited what was included, and the only things that were not included again were social security number, banking information, and credit card information.
This Paula says, we use an installed version of FIMS, not a cloud-based version. Are we affected by this breach?
So for FIMS, again, if it's self-hosted in the definition of your organization hosts the copy based on the disclosure from Blackbaud, it did not impact people again who hosted their own data or used a third party, not Blackbaud, hosting solution. They didn't state that, but I think that's a safe inference. Or people who, and for those of you who don't know this, Blackbaud is actively, or I'm going to say, I don't know how actively, but they have been trying to move people incrementally, that's probably a better word, to Microsoft Azure. So if you have already migrated to Microsoft Azure for hosting, you were not impacted. So again, to your question, if it is a self-hosted by your organization and you don't rely on Blackbaud to host your data, based on what we know today, you were not impacted.
David has a comment that he would like to share. He says, for what it's worth, our exposure was through a Blackbaud product we no longer use for over 2 years. While we're still a Blackbaud customer on other products, this suggests to me that there may be former clients affected that may not even know that they were affected. Again, Kyle, unless I don't think that we're prepared to comment on that, but David, thanks for adding that piece of information in the mix.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's helpful.
A couple of people want to know if we could comment on the decision to pay ransomware. The ransom. In your opinion, is the best practice not to pay the ransom, and how would you counsel clients to determine the appropriate response for a situation at hand?
Unfortunately, I can't comment authoritatively on that. And there's an entire industry of folks who provide that counsel who, when you are the victim of a ransomware attack or any type of criminal enterprise, whether it's a spoofing attempt or a phishing attempt, that can provide that type of counsel. To my reading of the disclosure by Blackbaud, the most immediate threat was limiting the access of clients to their systems and shutting down access. I may be misreading that, and maybe the risk was that the cyber criminals were going to deny Blackbaud access to the hosting environment. Again, because of the scant details, I don't know. But I think that Blackbaud was forced to make a financial payment. The nonprofit Times did have an interesting comment towards the end of the article about the ransom and inferences based on the financial disclosure requirements of Blackbaud being a publicly traded company, that it likely was not a significant enough amount of a ransomware that they needed to disclose it in their financials specifically.
I hope I'm pronouncing this name right. Tamam wants to know, do we know if encrypted fields were stolen as well, and Blackbaud is assuming they are safe because they are encrypted, or were encrypted fields saved elsewhere and not part of the stolen data?
I know, based on conversations with Blackbaud that I have been a part of, that credit card information was stored. I almost said stolen. I'm going to start over. Credit card information was stored in a separate vault. And what Blackbaud shared is that the technical investigation did not lead them, their findings were that that data was not part of the breach. It was not impacted. The other two pieces of information are encrypted. Again, I'm not a, or I shouldn't say again, I'm not a database architect, so I'm going to do my best here. They were not, those fields were encrypted, but not stored in a separate vault. The social security number and bank account information.
I just wanted to say to the audience that are asking us to speculate about what the nature of the breach is, or how it occurred, we don't know, and it wouldn't be proper for us to speculate on that. Another attendee wants to know, has there been any specific mention of Luminate being affected?
Build Consulting has multiple has multiple Blackbaud customers using Luminate, and none of them received disclosures relating to Luminate, and specifically Luminate Online.
Jody just offered a comment that her organization learned that the document ID field in Financial Edge for the I-9 data was not encrypted. There were social security numbers, driver's license number, passport numbers, etc., contained there. I don't know if we have a comment in regards to that, Kyle, but that is, thanks for putting that information into the mix, Jody.
No, my comment is I want to jump off the webinar and let some of my clients know that have FE. So I really appreciate sharing that information out. And this webinar has been really helpful, not only to the extent that it's been hopefully helpful to all of you, but I've gotten some great things to consider and more information. So thank you to everyone who shared more information. It's been really useful.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the questions and answers here to see where we should prioritize in the time we have remaining. Somebody asked, is Blackbaud liable for our data that was breached, if any? Again, that's not a question we can answer or speculate on. That's something that you need to consult your attorney regarding. Can an organization contact you regarding their incident of the Blackbaud breach? I think you certainly can if you have any follow-up questions for us. And if you have any specific questions in regards to how your organization should make their response or do additional discovery on its own behalf, you're welcome to do that. You can reach out to Kyle directly, or you can simply use the contact page on our website, buildconsulting.com. Somebody asked, can the slides also be sent as a PowerPoint deck? Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
We can. I don't know what our practice has been in the past, Peter, but I think I think providing a PDF would be something we could definitely do.
Okay, we'll do that. Somebody asked, our organization is in Canada. Is the breach being investigated in Canada as well as by any of our federal regulators?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good one. I don't think you should take this as the authoritative answer in the least, but given that the webinar that I participated on, that question was asked about the UK, I would imagine that Blackbaud is approaching the regulations of each country individually and notifying authorities as appropriate. But again, if for a Canadian colleagues, it's definitely a question to put to Blackbaud.
Somebody asked, would it be better to notify constituents via email or via print mailing?
So I think that you're going to have to do. You're definitely going to have to do print because you're not going to have, especially for all constituents, valid email addresses. You may not have any email address or a valid email address. If you haven't done a recent national change of address, there's a question for me about what the responsibility of nonprofits are to try to find the constituents that were impacted. And a point of clarification that came up with on a call that I was on earlier this week is that if you are obligated to notify, or you choose to elect to notify people because it's the right thing to do, using a targeted approach and only including people who have, for example, recently made a donation or somebody who's received a service from your organization recently. In my view, that would not be inclusive of the entire population of people who could be at risk were this data used improperly.
Somebody wants to know, we were told that a copy of your research point backup was part of this incident. Do you have any thoughts on what we should be thinking of regarding risk related to this specific issue?
I apologize because none of the people I interact with are active or use Research Point now or have in the past. I do know, and again, I'll say it again, I think every organization needs to approach this differently. I do know anecdotally that an organization that had Research Point that was impacted made the determination that there was not data that would compromise their constituents or put them at risk.
Another person says, in their FAQ, Blackbaud says, to view the fields your organization uses, you can access your production database. But how do we access our production database? This is Research Point related, and I don't believe RP is self-hosted by us. So do we have to ask Blackbaud for a copy of our backup?
So your production database, just to be clear, is the database that you access on a regular basis. Based on what Blackbaud, based on a response in the webinar that I attended, they are not able to provide a copy of the specific data that was removed. What they had been saying as of the webinar was that they know the dates of the breach were from February 7th to May 20th of this year. So hopefully that's helpful.
Somebody wants to know, were Importomatic or Merge-O-Matic affected?
I'm pausing because I don't one, I don't know whether they're affected, and two, I don't know what data would be put at risk through those specific products. So for those of you who don't know those two products, Importomatic is a tool that organizations can use to import large or complex or even small quantities of data into the Razor's Edge, and also provide, it has links to other products like Luminate Online and MailChimp and Classy. It is a data integration tool. And Merge-O-Matic, the second tool that the question was about, was a tool to mass merge duplicate records. So I think the question that I would have for O-Matic would be, is there any data that is actually stored within those products? And my assumption is that there is not data stored within those products beyond configuration files. And what I mean by that is the configuration files that map fields and you establish preferences and the rules by which data is imported or exported. But I think that's a question to put to O-Matic to get confirmation.
Somebody asks, how recent of a donation should we how recent of a donation should we contact donors?
This is my opinion, but I don't think that the construct is how recent. I don't think the construct should be around recent donors or even donors. I think it's all constituents in your database.
Jody asks, what is the name of the tool that will scan text fields for personally identifiable information?
Dag nabbit. I was hoping somebody didn't ask that question. So I don't know the specific name of the tool. Actually, Peter and I were looking into that earlier this week as we were sort of figuring out how to respond. Peter can amplify or correct this response, but it is possible to do in Microsoft SQL Server for those of you who have access to that. For one of my customers, I think, or one of my clients rather, the question is, can we engage a third party to do that, given that that's not something that anyone on the staff of this organization has the ability to do. It's definitely something that is a little bit advanced, but from my reading, Peter, I didn't think that it was an incredibly onerous or incredibly difficult thing to do. You just needed to have access to the right tools and skill set to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mark wants to know, do you know if Blackbaud have multiple clients in one database, or are there separate databases per client? When he says clients, I think he means like a Blackbaud customer, product customer.
So this is it's been a long time since I've seen the database architecture for the products that I've been talking about, but each customer instance is its own database that is deployed via Citrix on a virtual Windows server in their data centers, at least for those for organizations that are not in Azure. That's what I'm most familiar with. But your database is your database, and unless things have radically changed, your data is not commingled with other organizations' data. That doesn't mean that your data doesn't reside on the same server or in the same hosting environment, which I think is why so many organizations were impacted.
Somebody asked, did this breach also affect Blackbaud's gifts database, or is it just Razor's Edge, NXT, and Financial Edge, NXT? And another question that's related was, do we have any awareness of whether or not this has affected eTapestry?
I don't know about eTapestry just because of the disclosures that we've received, and I also don't know about gifts specifically. Those would be questions to put to Blackbaud.
Paul asks, is Blackbaud liable in any way for costs we incur in our assessment or disclosure of this breach? Kyle, I think the answer to that question is we don't know, and folks should engage their own legal counsel in that question.
I would just suggest that taking contemporaneous notes, I would recommend as you move through this, documenting the meetings that you have, documenting the time invested, documenting the activities that you undertake. I think all of those would be important things to do, if for no other reason that if a constituent were to ask you, what is it that you did, that you have a contemporaneous accounting of what it is that you did in response to this.
Cool. Well, at that, we're about at time. If we didn't have an opportunity to answer your question specifically, please, and you would still like a response, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, you can visit the contact form on our website, buildconsulting.com/contact. Kyle, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. I know that this is a rapidly changing situation. Information is coming in sort of iteratively. So I would encourage people to continue to monitor what information Blackbaud is providing and ultimately seek answers from Blackbaud that you feel like weren't answered today, that are really specific to your either products, specific to your organization. And I also would again encourage you to seek legal counsel and specifically seek legal counsel with a firm that specializes in these types of incidences.
And with that, we'll wrap up for today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. As Kyle said, we really appreciate it. This is one of our most well-attended webinars of all time. We ended up having around 125 people on this call. Great for such short notice. Thanks again, and have a good week.